When we don't play by the rules, there are penalties to pay. And it's the same for countries. The US has placed penalties on Iran since the revolution back in 1979. They say these sanctions are aimed at the government, not the people. Using these 5 things, I'm going to show you how sanctions are affecting Iranians' day-to-day lives. Medicine has become harder and more expensive to get hold of. Sanctions are not supposed to apply to medical supplies, but they do indirectly. Some drug suppliers are now refusing to sell to Iran to avoid falling foul of the US. This has led to shortages, putting thousands of lives at risk. There are people suffering from cancer, epilepsy, or hemophilia who are struggling to get treatment. And Iran can't even make its own versions of some of these drugs because it's difficult to import the essential ingredients. Washington, on the other hand, says corruption and mismanagement are to blame. They're so old, they still have ashtrays in the armrests. Some Iranians call them flying coffins. And no wonder. In the past 25 years, more than 2,000 people have died in air crashes involving Iranian planes. For 40 years, airlines in Iran have struggled to update and maintain their fleets because trade sanctions were imposed in 1979 after a hostage crisis in the US Embassy in Tehran.
The crowd shouted, "Death to the Americans, death to the Shah, death to Carter."
Iran was later hit by even more sanctions over its nuclear program. But under an international deal, in 2015, they agreed to limit their nuclear activities. It looked like Boeing and Airbus were going to sell Iran almost 200 new planes. But 3 years later, only a handful of planes were delivered before President Trump abandoned the deal and revoked the export licenses. So much for safe travels. Iran is dealing with ink shortages, and the price of imported paper has more than tripled since the US pulled out of the nuclear deal. Not good news for publishers of newspapers and books. Many well-established papers have now simply become several pages lighter. With existing heavy restrictions on press freedom in Iran, journalists and publishers say this situation will make it even harder to hold the government to account. This, a kilo of red meat, has become a luxury in Iran. It used to cost $10 before the new sanctions kicked in. Now it's more than double that price. Sanctions on Iranian banks have made it hard to import food. So many people have been forced to simply cut meat from their diet. Nearly a quarter of all restaurants in Tehran have shut down. And rationing has been reintroduced for the first time since the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. Iranians, like everyone else, use their smartphones to book taxis or food deliveries. But many international tech companies like Uber don't operate in Iran. So Iranian developers created their own versions, like this one, Snap. But the problem is Iran's 9 million iPhone users can't download these apps from the App Store because
under the U.S. sanctions regulations, the App Store cannot host, distribute, or do business with apps or developers connected to certain U.S. embargoed countries.
The internet in Iran is already strictly regulated and censored. So young Iranian developers are feeling the squeeze from both inside and outside the country. Whilst both Tehran and Washington blame each other for the sanctions, try convincing ordinary Iranians that these sanctions are not actually aimed at them.